Chapter 9, The Market Revolution, 1800 to 1840. I know I shouldn't have said that this was a boring chapter, but unless you're interested in new innovations and things going on, it can be. And don't panic. There's a lot of slides to this particular presentation, but there's an awful lot of pictures. So before we get started, I want to give you just a little bit of an introduction. After the revolution, of course, we Americans celebrated our freedom by political speeches and writings and newspapers and sermons. And freedom was said to make we Americans and our institution rather unique. Yet in this time frame, the understanding of freedom had changed. The revolution itself stimulated what we call three historical processes that quickened after the War of 1812, which we finished yesterday. The spread of market relations, the westward migration, and the development of a very robust political democracy. And this kind of shaped American society and led we Americans to associate freedom with economic opportunity, geographic mobility, and a democratic political participation. Unfortunately, slavery also had changed and shaped our American freedom. Because slavery moved west and expanded along with the growing nation. And the innovations in transportation helped spread slaves and slavery. And slavery created a racial boundary around American democracy that made voting, office holding, and even participation in the public sphere a privilege for whites only. But by the first half of the 19th century or 1800s, the economic changes and things that were brought about were called the market revolution by historians. Transportation and communication changes sparked these. Back in the colonial era, of course, technology had not advanced. Ships had not become faster. No canals were built, and manufacturing was done predominantly by hand at home. Roads were scarce, and when they were there, they were slow and bumpy. But in the 1800s, most farm families were not tied to the marketplace. They had very little actual cash money. They produced most of what they needed at home. And it was almost impossible for a farmer who lived away from the city or waterway to even get their produce to market if they wanted to market it. So let's have a look at what's going on. So what are we talking about? Major economic transformations, expansion of people producing for the marketplace, changing what they are producing and how they're even producing it. It's a completely new mindset. It's revolutionary. So what led to this? Specialization of labor, early industrialization, transportation and communication revolution, and of course the westward expansion, along with the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, which became known as King Cotton, and immigration and migration. Now these are not the same word. Immigration is people coming into the country. Migration would be people moving around in the country. And of course, then you've got government support for business. So specialization of labor. Now, what is outwork? What is a factory system? What is the Lowell and Waltham Mills? Well, we're going to get into that. Samuel Slater is called the father of the factory system because he kind of pioneered it. The Lowell-Waltham system was the first dual-purpose textile plant, and by this, we'll get into it just in a second. This is supposed to be a picture of his Francis Cabot Lowell's town in 1814, because he built a town around his little factory. And it grew and grew. The Lowell Mill, and these houses on the right of your screen would be dormitories. Now, dormitories, why would you need dormitories? Because he would go out into the local farming areas and recruit workers, predominantly young female workers. Now, if you had a family and you had 5 children and 4 of them were girls, all you'd have to do is figure out some way to get them married off and have some dowry for them or something. But if this man showed up and knocked on your door and says, if you let me have your daughter for a few years, I can teach her how to do something. I can teach her how to weave cloth. She'll be paid for this. She'll be housed in a place that's safe and secure with no men. She'll be taught how to read the Bible. She'll be taught good morals, and she can send part of her money home to you. Well, you jump at it like crazy. The idea of getting rid of your daughters. I mean, that sounds wonderful. This is an early textile loom, which, of course, we had stolen the plans for from England. Excuse me, I believe it's called industrial espionage. Early industrialization begins in England back in the 1780s, and just a short 10 years later, it gets underway here, but it really didn't start growing gangbusters until the 1800s. Mechanization, standardization, interchangeable parts. Let's spend just a minute of time on that. Mechanization is when you're using a piece of machinery to do something, like your mill. Instead of having to use the old-fashioned spinning wheel where you did it by hand, you did it with a big machine. Standardization means all the mills are the same, interchangeable parts. Now, back in the colonial days, if you bought a gun in Philadelphia and something happened to it, you had to go back to Philadelphia to have it fixed. But with all the parts of a one, say the West, some kind of rifle, say West, what was it, West, not Westinghouse, West, oh, I can't think of the name of the damn rifle. If you bought it in Philadelphia and something happened to it when you're in California, because of all these particular rifles had the same style and parts, they're interchangeable, you could get it fixed in California. And it's not just guns, it was pieces of equipment for machinery for farming, for wagons, anything. You standardize the parts so that you can have the same kind in California as you have in New York. New England textile centers began in the 1830s, and they began predominantly because it was in the north. That's where Mr. Waltham was. You also had a lot of waterways, and you wanted to build your factory on a waterway, be able to get easy transportation to Boston, and you used water in the cycling of your material. New England became dominant, as you can see from this little map. Most of it, I'd say, 85% of it's in the Northeast. Mr. Lowell says it started by approaching farm families and saying, we'll give your daughter a job. They were called Lowell girls. And what was their typical profile? Young, unmarried, very innocent, and they would be sent to the boarding houses where they had rules, and they had pages and pages of rules. I mean, you couldn't have a man above the first floor. You had to take care of your shoveling snow off the sidewalk in the wintertime. You had to do all your own work yourself. You had certain days for it, and you had to go to church. I mean, they were rigid. It was almost like being in prison, but the girls were doing a job, and they were getting paid, and most of their money was being sent to the parents. So what was boarding house life like? It was like being in a dormitory. Eli Whitney cotton gin, well, he produced this in 1791, but it was actually invented by a slave. The cotton gin basically was separating seeds out of the cotton. And the reason it came about was Mr. Whitney was visiting a plantation in South Carolina, I believe it was, or was it one of the Carolinas? And the widow of a Revolutionary War general, General Greene, she was very young when they married and very young when she became a widow, but she was very attractive and in charge of this plantation, but she was having trouble separating the seed, getting her slaves to separate the seeds out of the cotton. So he, shall we say, borrowed what the slave had invented and gave it to her. Well, the sad thing is he never made a dime off of it. He didn't get it patented. And within a matter of a year or two, of course, it had been improved on by several times. But the story is it was kind of a gift out of love to this young widow. But he didn't just do that. He also came up with an idea for making interchangeable parts for rifles. And he had his own gun factory, so he became quite wealthy. He was very innovative. Ellis Howe and Isaac Singer, of course, were known because they invented the sewing machine. John Deere and the steel plow, farming equipment. Silas McCormick and the mechanical reaper in 1831. So the first couple of decades in the 1800s are very fast-moving as far as innovation goes, predominantly for transportation or farming. Previously, it was expensive to transport goods, and the only way you could do it was put it on a boat and send it downriver. You had bad roads and no connecting rivers. And it cost as much to ship internally in the country as it did to ship something to England. So enter steamboats. Thank heavens, finally, we can go upriver and downriver. They start digging canals. Roads are beginning to improve. Railroads. As a matter of fact, forgive me for saying this, but in Kentucky, they had a system whereby anybody of the age of 16 that didn't have a job or wasn't going to school had to work so many hours for the state building roads. So the state never paid for it. It was just mandatory for these young men. And I thought it was a pretty clever idea myself. Keep them out of trouble. Samuel Morse invented the telegraph in the 1830s. Now we've got communication, and we also are going to have transportation improved. The Cumberland Road had been built back in 1811. As you can see, it starts in Baltimore, Maryland, and goes all the way to St. Louis, but it wasn't that good a road. It sure wasn't paved. And of course, the Conestoga covered wagons, which we are familiar with because of the people and the pioneers moving out west. But this was a main way to transport goods if you didn't have a waterway. The Erie Canal was the first major canal. It went from Albany, New York, all the way over to Rochester and Buffalo on Lake Erie, but it also had little canals coming off of it. And it's got 5 mentioned here that are off of the Erie Canal. It's just a fanciful picture of the locks and things you've got. It's begun in 1817, but it took a long time. It took, what, almost 10 years to complete. And thank God for Mr. Robert Fulton and the steamboat. First one was called the Clermont, and back in 1807. Now we can go upriver and downriver. That's just a picture of all the different canals and the inland freight rates as comparison to one year to the other. A lot cheaper than putting it on a clipper ship and sending it all the way down around South America. Oliver Evans, what did he do? Ah, steam carriage. Beginning of the automobile era. And the first automated flour mill. You've got several floors here. I mean, everything's starting to be automated. Iron horse. There's a race between a horse and the iron horse, and of course, the iron horse wins. In 1830, there was 13 miles of track built by a new company started called the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. 20 years later, we had 9,000 miles of railroad track, and 10 short years later, 31,000. Of course, 1860, we're getting into the Civil War era. But this iron horse, or the locomotive, was something really fascinating. Just a picture of the different railroad system. And you'll notice there's a heck of a lot more up north than there is in the south. Because the immigrant labor, like, from Europe and Southern Europe, Northern Europe, built the railroads in the north, but it was the slave labor that built the railroads in the south. And the slaves were good at farming, but they really weren't that good at building railroads. Telegraph. I can't imagine having to work on something like that, but to me it was an invention that saved a lot of lives. Transatlantic cable, 1858, right before the Civil War started. Now we didn't have to wait weeks or months to find out what's going on in Europe. We could find out within a matter of hours. And it was, man, all these inventions never stop. Westward expansion. Of course, the removal of the Indians. Well, a lot of that was, we'll learn about the Trail of Tears and relocating Indians onto reservations. That combined with transportation, new methods of transportation, and these brand new communication methods, we're going to move west. So you have streams of migration. Now, this is internal people moving, not people coming into the country, but people who are already here. Mostly from the lower south. You had some from the upper south. And some from New England, although more from the south than from New England. And, of course, it just opens up access to new resources. Once you get people moving west, we don't know for sure what all is out there. It could be a lot of different things. A lot of land. Cheap land. And this was one of the biggest pulls for the new immigrants coming into the country. And rise of the Cotton Kingdom. King Cotton. What caused it? The demands for cotton, especially in the United Kingdom and then here. So it opened up the deep south, which would be the Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana area, to new settlements. But it's going to have some problems. It further pushes the regional economic specialization into growing cotton. So the South becomes a one-crop growing state area. It revitalizes slavery because you need a lot of slaves to take care of all these cotton fields. And it causes a growth of the domestic slave trade. Excuse me. The eyewitness cotton gin, as I said, was actually invented by a slave back in 1791 for the widow of General Greene, but because of cotton gin, he caused an increase in slavery. Internal migration, gradual shift from countryside to the cities, because the young kids, the young men especially, didn't want to stay on the farm like their dads did. They wanted to go to the cities where the big lights were and get a job. And people who lived in cities moved more frequently. Immigration, in the 1840s, the Irish, in the 1850s, the Germans. And what pulled these people in? relatively cheap land, and even the thought of even gaining land like it did 100 years ago, the idea of having my own land, access to jobs in the cities, quick, long-distance travel. You can get from one coast to the other in just a matter of a few days, and political freedom. We don't have a king to tell us what to do. We can vote for our leaders. Push factors. Why were they pushed out? Because of political unrest in their own countries, or famine like the Irish and the potato famine in the 1840s. And lack of economic opportunity, the same problem there. You have a big family, and what's your oldest son's going to inherit the place, but what's your next son going to do? Going to go join the priesthood, or is he going to find a job? This is basically a graph showing the national origin of the immigrants from 1820 and 1816. As you can see, Germany and Ireland were the biggest. We stopped getting too much from Great Britain, but you had other countries. You had very few come in from Canada, very few from Latin America at this point in time. But for the most part, like I say, 30, 68, almost 69% of the immigrants coming in were either from Germany or Ireland. And why now from Ireland? Because now we've got that potato famine. And of course, you've got government-supported business. Government not actively involved per se, but it's just laissez-faire. In other words, government keeps their hands off. And when development of private corporations was stymied because government's not going to get in the business, but it's going to support them through legalities and going to court. It's going to help break up strikes. It's going to help build roads. So even though they're not actually putting money in or having their fingers in the kitty, they're doing everything they can to support business. Their theory being if the business is running well and being successful, then you're going to hire people, you're going to pay them wages, the people are going to take the money they earn, and they're going to go out and buy stuff, which means something more is going to be produced, and it's a continuing cycle. So the best thing to do is keep the businesses solvent and criminalize any strikes, because anyone that's a strike is a bad person. They must be an anarchist or something. They just, So the government always supports the employers. And of course, they passed a series of tariffs in 1816, 1824, and 1828 to make the cost of goods coming in, like the Irish linen and the English wool, make them so expensive that you would rather buy from here, like you'd rather go to Walmart than go to Kohl's. So basically what they're doing is creating a very business-friendly climate. Supreme Court rulings, all pro-business. Laissez-faire, government did much to assist capitalism, not by using money, but by just hands-off. So what happened because of all these changes? Rapid economic growth, periods of what we call boom and bust. In other words, I might have a good deal today, hire lots of employees, but then that contract may be canceled, and you may show up to work tomorrow and I say, hey, you never got a job because I haven't got any contract. So you have periods of fantastic boom, and then you have periods of unemployment. And of course, it's going to be the lower class that's going to be hurt. So you begin to see urbanization, which particularly the growth of the cities, because you've got more and more young people coming into the cities to get jobs. So there's basically changes in labor, and you begin to see people unhappy, so they're going to organize and try to get unions going. You see the rise of what we call nativism. Now, nativism, I don't think is even a word in the Bible. I mean, in the dictionary. It's basically, we're afraid of all these immigrants coming in. There's too many immigrants coming in. It's like we say the Mexicans are coming up here and getting our good jobs. No, they're not. It's like you can't get a job in New York because the people are coming in from Italy. Anytime you can't get work, you're fearful of someone coming in from that's not native of this country. You begin to see commercialization of farming in the Northwest, what we call agribusiness. And of course, there's some responses, both socially and culturally. They're not happy. So regional specialization. In the East, it's industrial. It's like the cotton mills and the plants and things. That's where the cotton goes that's grown in the South. In the South, you've got cotton and slavery. In the West, is known as the nation's breadbasket because they don't have factories. They're just growing like corn and wheat and things that we need in the South and in the East. Boom and bust cycle between 1790 and 1860. 70 years of ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. The blue line shows, for comparison, the price of a year's tuition at Harvard College. In 1790, it was $24 for a year. By 1860, it had risen to $104. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to go to Harvard for $104 for a year now? Population centers in 1820, basically, as you can see, right on the rivers. You've got New Orleans, you've got Montgomery, Charleston. I'm surprised they don't show Savannah. You've got San Francisco, St. Louis, Louisville, and most of these big cities are on rivers too. But by 1860, the towns have grown tremendously. We have towns that have 1 million people in them. You've got lots of towns that's got almost 250,000. I mean, the big cities are really, really growing. And like I said, there's changes in labor. There's a decline in what we call the artisan tradition, the person who makes a pair of shoes from the beginning to the end. And the workers have less to say or autonomy over their labor. You've got a supervisor, you've got a boss. And subdivision of tasks. Oh man, this is going to really, Mr. Ford's going to really take this and run with it. You no longer know half the time what you're making. You're told to sit there and put this screw in this hole. And you don't even know what you're putting the thing in for. It's just, that's what you do. But you become very good at putting that screw in that hole. You get more and more people telling you what to do and more people watching you do it. And there begins to be a sharpening of a line between work time and leisure time. And a shift from the price, labor's price, to labor's wage. Some said, I don't want to work for money. You know, aversion to wage labor. I think we have that in today's economy too. Women at the Lowell factory were replaced eventually by cheaper immigrant labor. And that's always been the problem. When your boss can find a cheaper way to do something, he's going to do it, and it usually involves employees. The company's losing money, the first thing it does is start laying people off. So what about this early union movement? The first party that was formed was the Working Men's Party in 1824 by Robert Dale Owen and others in New York City. But the early unions were weak, local. They were more social clubs than they were anything else. The workers' political parties were ineffective until after the Civil War. Some of the political organizations had great demands. They wanted free public education, an end to imprisonment for debt, a limit to work hours to no more than 10 per day. Wow. Wage earners compared their status to slaves and called their salary wage slavery. Back to the word that's not in the dictionary, nativism. These new groups of immigrants coming in, and there's so thousands of them coming in. Some thought these people coming in, especially the ones that are coming in and during this time frame, would be the newer immigrants. They would be from Southern Europe. They'd be from Africa. They'd be from Italy. They'd be from Ukraine and Russia. They were not our type of people. They were anarchists. They were subversive. They were Catholics. We had a feeling they were all against the democratic ideas in our country. So we had anti-immigrant riots and political campaigns, and we even had one political party called the Know Nothing. Well, this isn't it. I'll get to it in a minute. Called the Know Nothing Party. The Irish girls working at Lowe's, they were hired because the American girls got more money, and these little girls were just glad to get a job. We had this view of the Irish immigrant as being a drunk who was always wanting to fight, and although this is not true of all Irishmen, my grandfather was first-generation Irish, and believe me, he was a stereotype Irishman. He loved to drink. He loved to party. When he was in a good mood, he was wonderful. But when he had too many to drink, he was not very nice. And then, like I said, the Know Nothing Party, which I think is a riot. How can you spread or grow and recruit if when anybody asks you about your party, you say, I know nothing? But they were against Catholics. They were against Jews. They were against anybody that wasn't Native American. They were against immigrants. The Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, that's the way to fly the flag. So, as I said, we've got agribusiness, or the commercialization of farming in the Northwest. They're beginning to think more about the market. Beginning to think more markets and crop specialization. And they have to learn how to grow crops that don't require a lot of water, because there's not a lot of water out in the Midwest. They were pushed by the growth of the eastern markets, demanding more and more food because the cities are getting bigger and bigger and they don't have farms in New York City. You've got transportation networks now. You've got railroads across the country. You've got good canal systems. Transportation networks are great right now. And the availability of credit, which is something we haven't had too much of before. Improved farm machinery, and we saw that, new things are coming, the reapers and plows and things that are made out of steel now instead of, out of iron now instead of out of wood, especially after the 1840s. So this is basically showing you the different changes in transportation and occupation. Like from 1820 to 1860, you had a decrease in people working on the farm. Everything else increased. Mining, construction, manufacturing, especially manufacturing, went from 2% to 13%. The others are just basically service industries. They increased a little bit, but not all that much. Then you had the Second Great Awakening. Well, if there's a second, there must have been a first, right? Stands to reason. The religious revival began, the last of the 1700s. And some ministers, they were so concerned about losing their congregations and people not coming to church on Sunday, not participating, that they began preaching hellfire and brimstone. And I'm sure some of you have been to these churches where they're banging on the pulpits and you're going to die and go to hell tomorrow if you don't do this or don't do that. But you had some who preached of a loving, forgiving God. That's the kind of church I want to go to. They begin to stress private judgment and the possibility of salvation through faith and good works. Well, now that sounds good. I can see old St. Peter standing up there at the pearly gates with a book checking off, you did this, you did good, you didn't contribute to this. He's going to keep a check on all of our good works. Now, I'm not asking, it's none of my business whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant or you're Quakers or you're Methodist or whatever. But if you've ever been to a Methodist camp meeting, it's almost one long religious party that lasts a couple of days, and it's phenomenal. It's kind of like a big tent revival meeting that goes on for several days. Whoops, I just dropped something. You see, industrialization is scary. Change is scary to some people. And you look for solace, you look for a way to make yourself feel better. It's like a lot of people of my generation hate these cell phones and they hate the computers. Personally, I like using the blackboard and I like a phone that you had a dialer on. But I also really embrace new technological changes. Now, I don't like a change just for change's sakes. I'm still a bit upset over Pepsi changing the color of their cans 15 years ago. I couldn't understand what changing the color of the can had to do with the taste of the cola. But they did it and I had to accept it. The Baptist and the Methodist denominations grew. The Methodists grew the most, but even Catholics and Jewish participation in religion grew. We began to think maybe it was a good idea to get right with our Savior. Distribution of wealth. During the American Revolution, 45% of all the wealth in the country was in the top 10% of the population. The educated, yeah, sure. In 1845 in Boston, 4% of the population of Boston owned 65% of the wealth. 1860 Philadelphia, 1% owned over 50% of the wealth. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening more all the time. But still, everyone in this country regarded material advance as a natural fruit of American republicanism and proof of the country's virtue and promise. A German visitor in the 1840s by the name of Frederick List observed, anything new is quickly introduced here, including all of the latest inventions. There is no clinging to the old ways. The moment an American hears the word invention, he pricks up his ears. Well, that's not quite true, but wait a minute. Think about whenever they come out with a new phone, we have people sitting in line and picking up tents to get the newest, latest phone. My daughter-in-law is one of these people that anytime there's something new come out, a new computer or a new phone, she's got to have it. So who are the beneficiaries of all these changes and innovations that we're having going on? I mean, it's going to affect everybody from the poorest to the richest, right? Well, African Americans didn't benefit. Discrimination. They can't go to public school. They can't use the public facilities. They have the lowest paying jobs if they can get a job. And most of them are not allowed to move west. So they create their own businesses in their own churches. American women didn't benefit. Some women factory workers, their role was they decided that the husbands decided this basically. Their role was to stay home and provide shelter from the rigors of the daily life for the men. I want to repeat that. Stay home and provide shelter from the rigors of daily life for their man. I have a hard time saying that with a straight face. Republican motherhood was replaced by something called the cult of domesticity. And I think you guys might like this one. There's about 6 things you're supposed to be required of this. One is virtue. You must be sexually innocent. You must be beautiful and frail. You must be dependent totally on men. You would be seen as nurturing and selfless and ruled by your emotions. You're not in the public sphere at all. You have to remain confined to the home. Now this is their idea of a virtuous American woman. Well, let's be honest about it. Not much of a reality, especially for the lower and middle class woman, because she's too busy working. She worked outside the home and many times on a very low paying job, of course. And she couldn't sign a contract, and she usually couldn't pick up her own paycheck. But for the upper middle class woman who had some help that she could hire to help her with the household duties, she was expected to present this picture. So we had a resurgence of this in the 50s too, believe it or not. So many Americans experienced the market revolution as a loss of freedom. So many Americans saw opportunities in industrialization, but it also generated protests and anxieties. And that, my dear young ladies and gentlemen, is a very quick tour through the nation's market revolution.